Carlos Medina, Learning Services Manager at Catalyst of San Diego and Imperial Counties. I'm a Latinx male with a shaved head, seated, wearing black framed glasses and a white sweater featuring 2 polar bears and a holiday motif. I'd like to acknowledge that I am speaking to you from the traditional and unceded territory of the Kumeyaay people, and I respectfully acknowledge this legacy from the Kumeyaay. I also invite you to use the link that I'm going to drop into the chat box right now to research the tribal lands from which you are joining us today. And you can include a land acknowledgement in the chat box along with introduction of yourself and 1 word to describe you today. So before we start today's session, permission to pause. You have to go slowly to go far. I would like to invite a friend who I've just recently made, Supriya Lopez Pilai, Executive Director at Hidden Leaf Foundation, to open us up with an arriving so that we can ground in, take a few breaths together, refocus and reset, recalibrate for today's session. So Supriya, if I may, I'd like to hand the mic over to you.
Thank you so much, Carlos. Good morning, everyone. I'm speaking to you from Ohlone land here in Oakland, California. And I want to invite us all to practice a little of what we're going to walk into in this session. So I'm actually going to invite you to first feel grounded in your seat and take a moment to either look off screen and even feel free to turn off your monitor for a moment as we go through this short breathing exercise. So you can also take a moment to kind of settle inwards and feel free to close your eyes. Any of those options are open to you. We take a lot of time looking at our screens these days, and entering into this conversation, we want to kind of ground into ourselves and also feel for each other as a community. So gently let your eyes close or let them rest on the horizon and take a deep breath in, bigger than you think, and then let it out audibly. As you take your next breath in, a large breath, expand your rib cage forward, back, and to the sides. And again, let that out audibly. Take another deep breath in. Fill up, fill down, fill wide. Let that out audibly. Release. And now on your own, take 3 breaths. Take a moment to pause. Take a moment to go inward. And take a moment to settle. Let your eyes gently open. Welcome us back to our circle. And that is just a brief practice that any of you can use. The breathing where we breathe really deep into our rib cage is a way of letting the parasympathetic nervous system relax. And with that, I'm going to hand it back over to you, Carlos. Thank you all.
That was wonderful. Thank you, Supriya. I just kind of want to take a second to really settle into what I feel right now, which is calm, which is focused. And that is very welcome because as the moderator for today's session, there was a lot of anticipation, a lot of nerves just feeling it. But now I feel really good about this session today. I'm looking forward to sharing the space with you. And once again, just thank you to Supriya for guiding us through that. As I mentioned earlier, you joined permission to pause. You have to go slowly to go far. The inaugural session in the Ethos of Being Trust-Based series, which is brought to you by Trust-Based Philanthropy Project, Grantmakers for Effective Organizations, and Philanthropy California, the latter of which is an alliance of Northern California Grantmakers, Southern California Grantmakers, and Catalyst of San Diego and Imperial Counties, formerly San Diego Grantmakers. Today, we're going to explore the fundamental values and dispositions of a trust-based approach. But before we dive in, I'd like to open up with just a few Zoom Q&As so that we're all prepped for today's conversation. It seems like the chat box is jumping, so I feel like that kind of goes without saying, but in case folks would like to add to the chat box, you'll see it there. And during conversations later, you're more than welcome to include questions that you'd like to pose to our speakers. If you want to pose them in the chat box, that is one option. We would also encourage you to pose them directly to speakers. You can come off the camera. And if you'd like to do that, just raise your hand in the reactions button. There is an option to raise hands, and we'll make sure to include you to ask questions to your speakers. And finally, just for the housekeeping elements, you're welcome to keep your cameras on or off, whichever is comfortable for you. But during our breakout sessions a little later, we'd encourage you to keep your cameras on to provide an opportunity to connect with the folks you'll be chatting with. So with all that technical stuff out of the way, now I get to dive into the programming. But with that, I get to hand it over to my friend Shaady Salehi from the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project.
Thank you, Carlos. It's great to see you all. I see some familiar faces and names on today's session. So thanks for rejoining us if you've been at past sessions of ours. As Carlos mentioned, my name is Shaady Salehi. I'm the director of the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project. And I should do a little visual description of myself. Carlos, you did such a great job of that. I've got kind of wavy brown hair and I've got some potted plants behind me. Really what we're here today to do is to really explore some elements of trust-based philanthropy that go deeper than the practice. For those of you who have been following this trust-based philanthropy journey over the last year, you probably know that it includes a set of principles, grant-making principles about how to do grant-making practice so that it is more power-aware. Fundamentally, what trust-based philanthropy is all about is recognizing those inherent power imbalances that exist interpersonally between funders and grantee partners, but also that exist systemically in our society and how they show up in our sector. And recognizing those power imbalances and being more intentional about alleviating them, recognizing your power as a funder, and intentionally building relationships with grantee partners that are rooted in dialogue and collective learning. Ultimately, the work will be much more successful if it's built in partnership with grantee partners. So these are some of the ideas that undergird what trust-based philanthropy is all about. We've spent a lot of time articulating 6 principles that are the grant-making practices of trust-based philanthropy. Those are very important fundamental elements. Those include things like multi-year unrestricted funding, streamlined paperwork, being transparent and responsive. Beyond those practices, there's elements of how you actually show up. And so much of the work of how you show up happens internally, and it happens at multiple levels. So we've designed this series in partnership with Philanthropy California and with GEO, where approximately every month we'll be gathering and exploring these values and dispositions of trust-based philanthropy that are a little harder, they're a little less tangible than the practices, but that doesn't mean they're not as important. They're all equally important elements. And in fact, if you're not actively looking at all these values and dispositions holistically, it's not going to be fully trust-based practice. There's so much inner work that must be done. So the series will be exploring what is the inner work that we must do and embrace, what's the interpersonal work, what's that kind of interorganizational work, and what's some of the systemic level work. So that's kind of, we'll be parsing it out, kind of starting from within and kind of expanding from month to month. So I'll drop the link into the chat box for the remainder of the series. After this session, you'll get a follow-up about the next series. Some of you may have already signed up, but we hope you'll stay with us through this journey. This is going to be about a 5-month journey. We're going to do 5 sessions. And I hope you'll stay with us for the small groups, because I know sometimes that can be a little like, I didn't sign up for being in a small group today. You just want to kind of, tune in and not be engaged. I hope you'll get something out of this, because we've really thought intentionally about creating space for everyone to really apply these ideas and how they show up in your work life. So thank you again for being with us. And thank you for all of you who have signed up. We have like a record number of signups today. And so we're so grateful for you. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Carlos.
Thank you, Shaady. And I just want to echo what you mentioned about the breakout sessions. just in for me personally, having participated in not programming similar, but programming where we are discussing those most assumed cultural norms that aren't really tangible skill sets, it's always helpful to have a space and a sounding board to discuss with people who have shared similar experiences. And our work in philanthropy can oftentimes provide us shared similar experiences, but also can be different. And so there's an opportunity for us to grow from that potential conflict, and also opportunities for us to share space to heal together. So when I think about permission to pause and going slowly and why is it important to me, the first thing I think about, and I will speak for myself and presume this is a shared experience for many of you, is that our work is complex, and those complexities can sometimes feel chaotic. And placed in the context of current events, we're pushed to be hyperproductive problem solvers, and we are multitasking our tails off. And philanthropy has reacted swiftly to address global pandemics, threats to our democracy, and environmental devastation. But as we plan for next steps, strategic thinking and attuned sensitivities are important, and they're what's needed. So to cultivate these, we cultivate these by slowing down, stilling our minds, and listening to and trusting signals from our body, because that's the best way to sustain ourselves so that we can sustain the work that we are committed to doing and to support the communities that we are committed to serving. And so for me, just briefly, permission to pause means intentionally stepping away from whatever I'm doing, closing my eyes, and taking a deep breath. And then I take another deep breath. And then I usually yawn and I recalibrate and refocus, but I feel like focus is the operative word there, because I'm able to move forward of a place of intentionality and confidence rather than that thought chatter that tends to get in the way of the work that I want to do sometimes. And so there have been studies to show how taking deep breaths and calming down helps decrease stress, increase calm and energy. And so those are some of the benefits that we'll discuss. But I also want to share for me something that is personal and why this is more than just something I talk about. It's something I'm passionate about. So I really started to become conscious of slowing down in October 2018. Prior to that, I had all the tools I needed and I knew the value of it, but it was always seen as just something I'd get to later when it was convenient. And it was in October of 2018 when I had my first grand mal seizure and was diagnosed with epilepsy. Now that was a big transition. That was kind of scary. The initial parts were to first make sure I'm medically okay, everything was fine. And so I was given medication, so I'm good. But in that journey, I had to realize that there were so many other ways that epilepsy was showing up in my body, but I was discounting it because A, I didn't really know what epilepsy could look like, and B, I was just so focused on getting the work done that I wasn't paying attention to the signals in my body. And so now I have to pay attention if I have slept enough hours in the night, if I've eaten enough, if I'm hydrated, because all of those things will have a direct effect on how I show up, how my brain functions. And so this has become so much more than something I can think about doing later. This is something I have to do every single day. When I wake up, I take my medications, take my breakfast, and it's an opportunity really to operate from a place of mindfulness and intention, from the smallest task as cooking breakfast to having to coordinate a virtual summit. All of those things require focus and they require fortitude. And for that, I am thankful to discuss today's topic with our speakers, because we're going to dive into that a little bit deeper. Now, before we jump into story sharing and reflections, I also want to discuss why the topic of slowing down to go far is important to another area that's of very major significance to me, and that is racial equity. It's something that's important to me, also at our team of Catalysts at Catalyst. And there are illuminating parallels between grind culture and white supremacy culture. And as a resource that I would like to share with y'all, I'd encourage you to check out the NAP Ministries. I will include a link in the chat box to check out. And they're a great resource to understand those parallels and to figure out ways in which we can use rest as a form of resistance. And I'm reminded of a very powerful quote by Audre Lorde that says, "Caring for myself is not self-indulgent, it is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare." And just me, if I can frame things as a form of resistance, I'm so much more likely to stick with it. And so that's helpful for me to realize this is a form of taking care of myself, but it's also a way to stand up against a larger system that is not just affecting me, but it's affecting the people around me. And what better way to role model change than to show others that I'm willing to stand up to that system, and then to have that influence in the sphere of, in my spheres of influence in the people around me. And so with that, though, it's important to know that an individual's ability to flourish while pausing requires organizational openness and commitment. And so it's important for organizations to have these conversations and to discuss what cultural norms have we inherited and are we adopting in the workplace? And how might they be rooted in values that don't align with our own right now? And how can we change to create a workforce and a work culture that is rooted in caring for our community and caring for each other? And that starts with the rest. So with that reflections, and thank you for listening, I'd like to open up to some story sharing and reflections from our speakers today. I'm going to invite our panelists to share stories as well as practices related to the topics that we'll discuss today. And I also invite you to ask questions in the chat box throughout this conversation. I mentioned earlier, you are welcome to drop them in the chat box. If you're comfortable, we would also appreciate if you would come on camera and ask your questions directly to speakers. If you want to raise your hands, there is the reactions feature, and we'll make sure to call on you. But first, I'd like to start with introductions. We first had a chance, or rather, before I'm going to introduce speakers by name and have them to provide a little bit of background of who they are. We had a chance to meet Supriya Lopez Pilai earlier, Executive Director at Hidden Leaf Foundation. And joining Supriya is Pia Infante, Co-Executive Director at the Whitman Institute, and Shruti Jayaraman, Chief Investments Officer at Chicago Beyond. So greetings, friends. I'm grateful to share this space with you. And if I may, Supriya, I'd like to start with you with a brief introduction, and also I'd be curious to know why this topic of slowing down is important to you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Carlos, again, for inviting me to be here with all of you lovely, amazing people. So yes, I am the Executive Director at the Hidden Leaf Foundation. We are a foundation that is based in Northern California. And we've been around for more than 30 years. I joined as the Family Foundation's first non-family executive director, first person of color staff member about 2 years ago. And this topic is both near and dear to my heart, but also our work as Hidden Leaf. It has been the mission of the foundation to support contemplative practice for the sake of, and transformative approach for the sake of building a stronger, more cohesive, progressive movement. So we see it as integral at Hidden Leaf. And for me personally, you know, I would say about 10 or 15 years ago, when I was at the Funders Collaborative on Youth Organizing, we were seeing a dramatic shift in the way young people were approaching organizing, saying we are not going to do it the same way as our elders, largely also being influenced by feminist and gender justice movements, where it was more kind of inherently part of the model of organizing was to include practices of healing as a form of resistance, healing as a form of organizing, healing as a form of visioning and strategizing. And so one common sort of anecdote that I share is that young people would be on the cover of the New York Times, for example, one day for the victories they won, but on the corner the next day without a job, burnt out, having done so much, you know, organizing, and seeing that in their elders. And we knew we needed to make a shift. And that's actually part of the place where I met the Hidden Leaf Foundation, a foundation that was really engaged in that. And I will say in the last 10 years, not just of Hidden Leaf's work, but philanthropy and a shift in the way that organizing is happening out there, we see how the ability to pause, the ability to reflect is not just one that has just kind of come up recently, but is actually something that has been baked into many of the cultures and communities that our communities are fighting for and with. So that be they indigenous practice, be they practices of lineages which have been incorporated through things like somatics, it is really part and parcel of the organizing model. And we have seen dramatic shifts in the way people vision and gain victories. This year in particular is a really important year to consider how we pause, given all that's happening in the world, to just kind of go through with working the way that we work hasn't been the way to reach kind of the large goals and being productive at the same level. We've just gotten so much feedback about that from our grantee partners and from so many of our other partners, which I'm happy to talk about more as we get into this conversation. But this has been probably the most important year to live our values around why we fund and support people taking that pause, but also embodying that in the work so that there's kind of a broader movement permission to pause for the big work ahead. So I'll pause there. No pun intended, and pass it back to you, Carlos.
Thanks, Supriya. And I like what you mentioned about role modeling that work, because I might just think in my own life, whenever I have to make a change, it's always helpful to see someone in a position of power who can demonstrate for me what that could look like. And it helps me feel more confident in making that step. So thank you. And then Pia, if we can shift to you just briefly to learn a little bit about your organization, your background.
Hi, everyone. Pia Infante with the Whitman Institute. I'm Filipina. I'm wearing a lilac colored shirt and I'm sitting in front of a window where we might see hummingbirds. So pay attention. The Whitman Institute is spending out. So I think between, I don't know about you, but between 2020 as a experience and everything we already had planned to do this year, I feel like what I want is permission to not just pause, but to integrate, permission to grieve. Right before we started this webinar, I was reminded by a comment that, some of us have already lost people to COVID or to this country's systems of racial inequality, losing, or in the process of helping to survive. And, during the course of this year, I would joke around with my partner and say, if we are alive and standing at the end of this year, it is a victory. If we still have our health and we still have our sanity. But victory isn't just surviving, right? Victory is the ability to be whole, to have dignity. And I think this is the kind of year, as you said, Carlos, so beautifully, with the levels of complexity and the rage and grief and power and fierceness all wrapped up into it. It could be the kind of year where we lose ourselves, we lose our values for embodying embodying the world we want to live into. And there's a lot of examples from 2020 of this is not the world that we want to live in. And so many of us, some of us putting lives on the line, many of us in funder and donor and resource giving roles, capacity building roles, feeling like it's part of our life's work to support the powerful movements that are trying to bring us beyond the catastrophic experiences of 2020 in terms of democracy, public health, social well-being, and racial justice. So when I think about why it's important to me, I think it's, the need to integrate and to be whole and have dignity is exactly what many of us feel like we're working towards. And the irony, as we've talked about over and over again, whether we work in the nonprofit sector, we've been organizers, and even the way that we have, philanthropy is a very privileged field. We often have much more, I think that there is some harm that the concept even of self-care has done. It makes it seem as though self-care is just an individual choice and you're bad and wrong if you're not making it. The truth is that the way our society is structured is that it isn't just a choice. It isn't just a personal, habitation. It is in many ways systemic, that there's a bunch of us that do not have space, to have any space between childcare, working, community responsibilities. So I guess that's what I want to say is permission to integrate is an individual and collective orientation and decision and intention. And we have to actually fight for it. And that is, I think, why it's so, this particular notion is so important to me. And the last thing I'll say is how I was thinking about how this shows up in philanthropy is that we are in some ways cultural influencers because, you know, this society affords so much power to where dollars go and how dollars go. And I think that is what essentially is trust-based philanthropy, is that we are being thoughtful about this power. And so we're being thoughtful both about how we do it, as it's named in the principles. We're being thoughtful in our relationship with ourselves and how that's the blueprint for how we relate and communicate and honor others. Because if we're not honoring ourselves, then it's pretty hard to honor other people and see other people. And then, of course, you know, we have nonprofit movement grantee partners for whom we award. Literally, the word is award, right? So if we're always awarding the self-sacrificing, the burnt out, the, like what you said, Supriya, if we're awarding people, you know, awards on the cover of the magazine, and then allowing them to flounder in terms of homes, well-being, public health, you know, then we're not actually living our values. We're actually just, it's superficial, and we just want that pat on the back. So I may be rambling a little bit in my comments. I'm sorry. I wanted to help set the ground for, if you feel like you haven't taken very good care of yourself this year, you're not bad and wrong. You know, it's been difficult. It's been a difficult year, and America's often response to things is workaholism. So if you feel like, oh no, I'm coming to this webinar and I'm so bad and wrong for not having I haven't meditated for 3 years. I haven't, you know, the last thing I'll say is when we say permission to integrate here, we're not saying it's a 10-day mindfulness retreat. You know, it could literally be just looking out a window and putting hand on heart and putting hand on belly and just saying, you know, all of me is welcome right now. And I belong here, and we belong here. And we don't just have a right to be whole. You know, we have a call to be whole. So let's not make permission to pause another stressful, perfectionistic work task or checklist, you know. Let's just invite ourselves to be open to the question, you know, how to be whole in the complexity and sometimes really fierce grief of this work and this year. So I'm really honored to be with you today, and I hope hummingbirds will visit us. Thank you.
Thank you, Pia. I feel like that was meditation app I could have just closed my eyes to and listened to while walking in the park. So I appreciate your reflections. And the part that really stood out to me is the duality of both the individual journey and also the organizational journey, because change begins with each of us, change begins with you. And then also change evolves in the way that we show up in the workplace and the way we're able to advocate with our peers towards shifting the culture, which can be scary, but I think what's helpful is having these conversations where we can chat with each other and we can lean on each other as sounding boards to see what that looks like, to envision that world into reality. So thank you. And then I would also like to hand it over to, and actually, Shruti, we chatted a little bit before, but I'd love to learn a little bit more about you, the work that you're doing with Chicago Beyond, and also why slowing down is important to you.
Of course, good morning. What a pleasure to be here with all of you, many friends among you and many new faces as well. I am dialing in from the land of the Ojibwe and the Potawatomi, and I'm wearing bright purple with a plant that I'm realizing is getting alarmingly close to me. So we might need to relocate one of us soon. Chicago Beyond, so we are focused on the freedom to live our fullest human potential, and specifically focused on young people and on equity. So as Supriya said, it's been quite a year for us as well in this work. We invest in ideas, people, and organizations. We've been at it just a few years. This question of why pausing is important. I mean, first of all, personally, I am very grateful to a lineage of teachers that have, changed my life entirely over the last several decades. But really, I think given a precision and a discipline around this idea of pausing, which I think just creates an invitation and an opening into it, and a language around it that I think can help us deepen our conviction in it. And as we go deeper, it truly is an invitation that you take one step and you see what it opens, and then that brings the next step. So it has been a delight to be in that journey, and it's brought so much joy, I think, to our work at Chicago Beyond and the day-to-day. In the context of the work, Carlos talked about signals and also about racial equity, and Supriya and Pia, you both talked about, I think, the humanness of in the work. I wanted to just comment, I think, on being and undoing. In the domain of being, in my tradition, these two are integrally one. But to take them separately for a minute, in that domain of being, what Shaady shared about what trust-based philanthropy is about, that humanness, which is at the core of it. And that idea, I think, even of moral leadership, like the pause is where the humanness lives, right? The pause is where our courage of conviction that allows moral leadership to happen, that's where it flourishes, that's where it grows up. So I think just thinking of this as, allowing being, but then I want to spend some time in the domain of doing, because as many people have mentioned, we are a very doing-oriented culture. And I think in that domain, again, particularly when it comes to this work of equity, seeing this as not a nice to have, but really structurally part of the work. And I say that because when we say, inequity is systemic or racism is systemic or these things are structural, what that actually means is that the suitcases we all carry around with us, the defaults that are wired into things, all carry these same things in them. And so if we just sort of carry the suitcase without thinking, if we just go on autopilot or just trying to move fast and kind of do the next thing in our effort to be good and do good, we end up importing some of the things that are exactly the things we are trying to address without even realizing. And we see that, right? That many foundations on this call, we can start with so many different whats. We can start with the environment, we can start with youth organizing, we can start with violence, we can start with housing, we can start with education, we can start with safety. At Chicago Beyond, because we are about, again, that humanness, it's all of these things, because in a human life, they all show up. But regardless of the what, we seem to come out with outcomes that we feel are falling short, and we seem to replicate inequities again and again. And so I think it almost becomes an imperative to pause and to say, what is it that's built in that we're rushing past, that we somehow keep doing, and despite our best intentions, aren't getting, for the young people we love, I'm not waking up in the morning and feeling like we got this, if we just keep going on the path we're on, we got it. So in that doing register, I'll just give one quick example. Early on in this year, and as Carlos said, it's been a hell of a year, and it continues to be. But early on, in trying to formulate our crisis response to COVID and to the multiple pandemics in Chicago, we actually had our team do kind of a structural pause, which is part of how we operate. And it might sound totally counterintuitive. Like the first thing you're going to do when we're in a crisis is pause, really? Like, is there time for that? Did you not hear the part about the crisis? But actually that discussion, we talked about the 1995 Chicago heat wave and how inequity showed up and how the responses were formulated. We talked about the GI Bill. We talked about a number of different examples in the past. And this was before the racialized data came out about COVID. This was before, long before, PPP was even a bill, let alone distributed inequitably. But I think it really shaped our team's response to, some of the food and basic supplies and the supply chains we ended up building and the ways we ended up thinking about who was actually reached and who was actually not reached specifically, and how were we showing up in that. And I genuinely think, for all our founding principles and our experience in this work and who we are as a team and all of that, had we just rushed, there's just so much built into where the existing infrastructure is and isn't strong, and what is easy to do quickly and what isn't, that we would have ended up in a very different place. So I wanted to offer that example in the doing domain, because I think it's structurally part of this work, not as a nice to have, but as something that makes it more joyful, makes it more human, and actually relates to the impact we're trying to have.
Thank you, Shruti. I appreciate your discussion about structures, and thank you to all of our panelists. And I think that's a good segue to the next question I wanted to ask, which was, why are we here? Why does something that may seem so simple as pausing require a longer conversation about cultural norms? And so if we can, Shruti, I'd like to stay with you and just hear a little bit more on your perspectives.
I can name a few to kick it off. I think maybe there's a thing about the real world being realistic. There's a thing about being efficient. I don't have time for that. I think there's a thing about control and things sort of staying tidy and orderly and not getting vulnerable. And when we pause, I think it can feel like an interruption to any of these things, right? It can feel like, that pausing stuff is great for my bliss life, but I've got the real world over here that I've got to deal with, right? That pausing stuff is great when I have time, but right now I'm trying to be efficient. I'm trying to get something to my board, and I need to get this together. So when there's time, I'll get to it. Or that pausing stuff might be nice, when there's room, but right now, like this is the framework, this is the box that we're working in, and I'm trying to be really good at this box. So there's no room for all that or the stuff that might come out. So I think these are very real things at the level of the organization and the investing work that we are all in. And then I think there's a personal dimension of it that makes it really hard, which is coming back to that suitcase. I'm kind of thinking of like, you go through customs at the airport and they say, did you pack everything in your own suitcase? And you say, yes, right? None of us packed everything in our suitcase. When we look in there, there's stuff that's like, our dad's stuff, our great aunt stuff, grandmother, some friend who said something from childhood. And that's there's all of that stuff in there. And some of it is socially constructed and some of it is personal. But it all shows up in what we're carrying around and how heavy the load feels. And so I think all of these reasons, both personally and organizationally, make it very easy to just keep moving, right? To just keep carrying the suitcase and try to work a little harder, be efficient, and we're rewarded for those things. But I think truly when it comes to, trying to do transformative work, which I think is the moment we're all in, we're not trying to edit a little bit around the edges somewhere, right? We're trying to then, again, once we step into that pause, when we have, we call our grantees investments, and there's intention behind that. When we have an investment kind of say, hey, years ago when we sat down and really spent time developing a proposal, like that's what set us on this journey to systems work. That is like an incredible moment where I bow my head and just feel like grateful to be in the flow of the universe. Because that permission that we have the opportunity to offer others when we step into it ourselves, it opens up the incredible creativity of human beings to not just edit around the edges, but to invite that bigness, which might not be so efficient and might not be fit in the box and might be a little messy, but is just, what does things for people. Does that answer, Carlos? Am I on the right question?
Yes, absolutely. And what I appreciate is this conversation is generative. There is no right or wrong. There's just your wisdom that you've collected through your lived experience, and we're here to share it together. And so thank you. And I like what you mentioned, and it reminded me of Supriya, when we had our chat a couple of weeks ago, you talked about investments that your organization, Chicago Beyond, does with its partners in terms of providing them space for reflection. And I'd like to hear more about that. And then also your perspectives on why are we here?
Carlos, I got a little confused because were you speaking to me or were you
Yeah.
talking to Shruti?
Oh, no, apologies to you, Supriya.
Oh, okay. Oh, for me. Okay. So why am I here? Well, I just want to take a step back and actually, Pia and Shruti said a few things that just really I want to underscore and uplift. You know, one of the things that I feel like has happened for many of us in this year is you just cannot segment yourself and say, you know, I'm going to show up as this person in this container over here, and then I have these other parts of my life over there. And Shruti, I really appreciated how you just framed the being and the doing. And one thing that we are really talking about and trying to live into is that, you know, we are whole human beings that come with multiple dimensions, be it your spirit-based work, be it your, cultural work. And often what happens is that we privilege a particular kind of intellectual way of engaging the work. Folks will often say, you know, I'll go to Washington, D.C. and I'll do my lobbying work and I'll do my advocacy work. And I just come back completely depleted. Like I just feel like I couldn't bring my whole self to that space. And like, what are we doing if that's what we're kind of funding and advocating for people to be kind of going out and doing? And what we're seeing more and more is the like bringing together of models of whole selves, of whole people. And in one particular organization, I can think about like 10 years ago, people were like, you know, going for wins at like the city level, if you will, and, you know, incremental steps. I like what you were saying, Shruti, like there's incremental steps. And even then, like, you know, and progress isn't just linear, right? Like some people were making leaps at that point, but with this sort of seismic shift of embracing sort of the whole self model of thinking about like our organizing models aren't just about campaigns and victories. It's as much about the losses and it's as much about the practices that we put in. It has dramatically shifted the way people are visioning their work. And we as funders watch that and we see like these unlikely partnerships start to form by virtue of people pausing, reflecting, who is my whole community? Who have I identified as like the enemy? Who have I not moved with in a particular way? And how dramatically that has shifted the capacity to quote unquote win and the capacity to make that big leap. Well, we as funders can't be just looking at that on the outside and, you know, and even funding that. I think we at Hidden Leaf had always been kind of funding that space for reflection because we believe that in the reflection, more enormous vision can kind of show up and people can live their true and authentic self. But how are we turning that back on ourselves as funders? How are we kind of saying, well, you know, where's the space? You know, we also, and I think particularly in family foundations, it feels like, well, we can't take that pause. We don't want to invest in that in us. Like we should be putting that money out there for folks to be doing that. Doesn't make sense. But actually, if we are learning from communities and from the groups that we support around how they model liberation and live into that, we are part of that equation. And if we are not looking at the way that we are moving our resources and our relationships in a liberatory model, and if we are not taking the time as funders to actually think about, you know, how are we showing up both individually in our organizations in this work with our grantee partners, but how are we actually showing up alongside movement in that same way, then we're not actually going to get towards liberation. And I will say that that regard for us at Hidden Leaf, like, so we have invested in individual practice around somatics and other practices. And we do this like individually and collectively as an organization. It has actually shifted the way, one, it has opened up the foundation to think about like, how do we move beyond our family? You know, how do we kind of open up that space? Two, how do we think about more than what we have? And I like what you said, Shruti, like talking about this as investments and being very intentional about that. We need to liberate our dollars. Like we need to actually liberate the resources. And Pia, it's so exciting to hear what Whitman is doing. That notion of trust-based grant making is actually trust-based philanthropy. So we took it at Hidden Leaf as trust-based grant making, and then it expanded to trust-based philanthropy. And it was like, wait a second, what are we doing with our investment dollars? how is that not participating in the same way towards the liberation for communities? And how is this grant dollars, like you can, as Pia said, you could actually be doing harm by thinking you're doing good, by doing this kind of grant making, even with all of the trust-based principles. If we're not looking at all of our tools in the same toolbox around liberation and not seeing how valuable our relationship capital is, our investment capital is in that same bucket, then we're not kind of, we're not kind of working towards a whole picture of liberation. And I will say that, we're just starting on this journey. It brings up a lot of fear for us internally around like, are we spending down and what does this mean around our legacy? But if we do this alongside our community partners, and if we really lean into that notion of trust, we kind of have to relax and think about like, we are still in a very privileged position. We can take that moment to pause, but like that moment to pause has to go to the big leap at this moment, because that privilege is like, we're holding that wholly all ourselves. Like, how do we share the risk? How do we share and create the ground for others so that they may have the ability to pause, so that they may have the ability to vision, and so that they may direct the resources where they actually need to go for the liberation of people and the planet. So that's some of, it might have answered the question, it might have gone in other directions, but it's some of where the kind of internalizing of the practice has led to us more deeply saying, okay, what are our values and how do we live them? And I'll just say one more thing, Shruti, this kind of reminded me of from what you were saying. The place that Hidden Leaf came from, Dave Brown, who is the father of the Brown family from whom the foundation grew out of, he actually was a Buddhist. And that is what he believed through his values of Buddhism was the best way to give away his wealth in his lifetime was through the Hidden Leaf Foundation. Dave Brown unfortunately passed away some years ago, but I believe that we kind of ground into the values of Buddhism to really think about how do we liberate those dollars. And we've kind of evolved in a way from what Dave's original thinking was around liberating those resources now to think about like the investment dollars. So this is that place where I say we have to be our whole selves. We can't just say, okay, this was our values around kind of our spirit-based practices, but this is how, taking on the best practices of corporate models of, how philanthropy should be governed and dictated. That's separate. No, actually, how do you bring those values together to really live out loud the way in which you believe these resources need to live in the world and generate and regenerate for the local economies. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Supriya. I mean, we can go on all day. Unfortunately, there is a time limit for today's webinar, but I'm looking forward to connecting with you and continuing this conversation. And as you're talking about thinking about how we're doing harm when we're trying to do good and intentionally repeating cultural norms that may not, or rather, as you reflected on what Pia said earlier about unintentionally producing harm for our practices, I'd like to return to you, Pia, and just share your reflections and thoughts about why we're here, and maybe some reflections on what Supriya and Shruti mentioned also.
Well, apparently I am here to sit at the feet of you people and just learn. So thank you. I'm learning so much. I'll be very frank. I think I'm here today particularly as a representative of the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project, because with the elevation of trust-based philanthropy as possibly, I don't know, the shiniest new coin in philanthropy. Everyone wants a sticker, and I think I'm excited about that, of course. And I want to make sure to articulate over and over again that embodying these values as we do this work is like you all are saying, Shruti and Supriya, it is the work, we can't say we value human dignity and racial equity and use the same tools that are being used, to perpetuate, power hoarding and power imbalance, and basically many grant-making practices continue to be pretty undignified for the ones who are seeking funding, and can be repetitive, humiliating, and exhausting. So to me, I don't think we get to slap a trust-based philanthropy, sticker on ourselves unless we are not perfect at this, but intending to embody the values in how we communicate, how we show up, how we talk to people, how responsive we are, how transparent we are, how much we take feedback or don't. For instance, I'll just say that I feel like there have been a number of, I have nonprofit folks coming to me and saying, so this foundation out there is talking about being a trust-based funder, but I'll just tell you my personal experience is a horror show. Like I've never felt so, spoken down to or patronized. And yet, here they are saying we're trust-based funders. So part of the motivation, I think, for this series is to make sure that we're not holding trust-based philanthropy as a checklist, as a just the technical tools, but we're holding it the way that is being described so eloquently by all of you, which is it's a liberatory and radical practice of fighting for the human dignity of everyone in the ecosystem, right? So we, by privilege, get to kind of live in that kind of dignity because we're afforded power and decision making as funders. But I think that that is very frankly why I'm here. I don't think that we at TWI or at any of the institutions represented here would claim that we know everything and that we should tell you exactly what to do. But I think that we're learning and we're transparent and we're willing and we want to be in dialogue and relationship and listening to how we can continue to recalibrate. And the last thing I'll say, Shruti, is your comment that you took a deep pause before jumping in to help deal with a crisis. And in doing so, you built new structures and systems. So we cannot build new, right? When we're in a rush, like you said, we'll just go with what's already there, whatever vehicles and whatever ways of doing things already exist, which is what most foundations do. They just copy a structure that already exists and a way of doing things that already exists. And I think the invitation of this series and of this project is just like going all the way back to how you value, your mission and the communities you're accountable to. Go all the way back to that and then ask, in a way that's pausing and integrative, but then also moves into doing. How do we embody these values in everything, literally everything we do, and take feedback when we're not? So that is why I'm here.
Thank you for those questions, Pia. I think there are opportunities for us on the call to reflect personally, which I think is a wonderful segue as we move towards our small group peer reflections. And so as we do, or rather before we do that, I wanted to invite one or two of you, if you could please share a model of a response, or rather to model a response to the prompts in terms of your experience as an example that you've had before. And you have a few have had shared some. I know, Supriya, you mentioned some of your work at Hidden Leaf Foundation, but if others would like to share, we'd love to hear it.
So Carlos, you're just asking for any responses to the prompt questions, which are whose permission do you need to pause? And if you have that permission, what would happen?
Yes, thank you.
So would you like me to share? Okay.
All right, thank you, Supriya.
I will share this story. This last year, many of you who represent, foundations that have given support specifically for COVID response, emergency response money, or if you've relaxed all of your reporting guidelines and whatnot, we're trying to free up the ground so that, it's like my good friend Farhad Ibrahimi wrote this wonderful article. He's at the Chorus Foundation. Why does it take a pandemic for philanthropy? And I can't remember the whole time, but why does it take a pandemic for philanthropy to actually show up and be what it needs to be? And how can we keep this practice going, right? So we're all excited. We're like, okay, we've learned, like we want to do what's right. And then I'm talking with many of our partners and they said, it's so interesting. Like we have all this space, but like no one's taking time off in the organization. No one's actually, I would say this was back in March. No one's actually like pausing. No one's, you know, people had, you know, if they got sick, yes, they had to stop, but like the guilt and like, we hadn't, you know, the culture hadn't shifted to adapt to a pandemic, you know? So one of the things that really came out clearly in the very beginning was that if leadership didn't stop to pause, people didn't feel that they could, the rest of the organization didn't feel that they could take that pause. And so, you know, many people started to kind of institute, like, we're going to take this week off in the month, or everyone's just going to stop. But it just made me reflect. And I think we had this conversation, Carlos, earlier, like, who do you need to actually ask that permission from? And it's often just yourself. Like, what is going on that we don't give ourselves the space to just say, I need a break. And sometimes if you hold a position, a particular position, whether it's your own perceived notion or what's put on you by virtue of your title, you feel like, well, it's not me that can do that. And actually it's like intricately important. Or I will say, I look to my board, right? And like, they don't feel that they can do it. As I said earlier, like, you know, many times in philanthropy, the foundation leaders are saying, well, but that's an indulgence for us to actually do that. And so who needs to actually kind of first tap in? It's like, we need to actually calibrate for ourselves and take that permission ourselves. And then I will say the other part of it then is then asking for help and support to be able to do that. Because sometimes you don't even really know, you know, what you, I know I need to take a break. Well, I felt like I needed to turn to my team, and we all kind of came up with structures of accountability to help and support us through this particular year. And, you know, guilt is all wrapped up in there. And I often think about how, you know, I grew up as a child of immigrants, as, you know, in this notion of like, to be productive and have a place of value on this earth, one must always be working. In fact, my own father has a saying, if I rest, I rust, which came from his Swami. And so it's like a placard in my house. And so, you know, really undoing that to understand it is a privilege. You know, my parents were working class. It was a total privilege, you know, to take a pause. Like, when do you actually have the time and the capacity? But really, one has to turn inward and then create the kind of culture within the organization where we hold systems of accountability to allow us to take that break. That's some of my reflection.
Love it. Thank you, Supriya.
Yeah, and it's so true. It's like there's this fear of this unnamed, like, if we stop this for a minute, if like the frenzy doesn't continue, then it's a fear of there's some alternative that we just don't even want to look in the face, right? We kind of say, like, whether it's I'm going to become like a blob on the sofa and have a lifetime of daytime TV, or I'm going to just stop being productive, I'm going to stop contributing, I'm going to be taking something self-indulgent that, you know, why do I deserve it? There's any number of things that just make us not even look at that in the face, and therefore we choose this without even examining, like, were these really the two choices? You know, or is there a third thing that is a dynamic stillness, you know, that is neither the rust nor the frenzy, that could actually be more generative, that could actually be more joyful. But I think it's very hard to even allow ourselves the curiosity to look at that, because there's so much fear and so much guilt around even this, that we just sort of, it's like, keep going, because if we look too hard there, the whole thing might fall apart.
And I'm just going to add one more thing to that, Shruti, and I think, Pia, you said it. I just want to say what's really hard about pausing this year and taking that break is the grief. Like, sometimes to pause. I mean, I'm homeschooling two little ones here while working, worried about my folks, you know, who are worried about, like, there's just so much worry. And then we have people around us, close to us, dying, who are struggling. Like, this is an enormous year of grief. And another teacher who I work with that many of you might know is Norma Wong. And she speaks so much about how, you know, we actually have to have the space to grieve, but isn't it so scary if we aren't from a culture, or we weren't raised in a particular way, and the dominant society that we sit in doesn't really have a whole lot of space for normalizing grief. But grief is so much, very much, and you know, thinking, Shruti, about the systems we're dismantling, there's a grief in that, because you're moving into an unknown, even though that unknown is liberation and it's joyful. people are grieving what was and what is. And Pia, as you said, many of us don't want to go back to what was, but yet without knowing, so there's the real palpable grief of like the loss of human life that is imminent and visible, and so on at such an enormous level this year, that is only endemic of what's actually been happening for 400 years in this country and globally for so long, but yet it's living in us. It's generationally within us. And so to pause and to kind of let that open, to sit on the sofa and watch daytime television and be such, I can't wait to have that moment, but at the same time, it's like it opens a floodgate that we have to also have some capacities. And this is another part of the work. Where do you invest in the capacity, the emotional and spiritual capacity to actually deal with all that's going on? Because that is not something that just kind of comes to us. So that's another reason why I know pausing is very scary for a lot of folks.
Thank you, Supriya. I really appreciate those reflections. And I think hopefully folks are prepared for our break-in now. Just to let you know, we're going to do random assigned breakout groups to reflect on the question, whose permission do you need to pause? And what I would encourage you to do is just take a minute or two to journal or think to yourself about that question, and then you'll have the space to chat with your other participants to reflect on what you thought about from that question, and also just reflections on today's discussion. So our colleagues are going to go ahead and do their magic, sort us into breakout rooms, and then we'll reflect back. We'll come back together around 11:20 for final reflections.
Thank you, Carlos. Beautiful. Sad to see we're losing people for the small groups, but
I'm looking forward to lively conversation with folks, and we'll get started in 2 shakes. Thank you.
Yeah, just give me a second here. I'm kind of adjusting as folks drop off. So I want to make sure that those of you who are sticking with us have other partners to talk with. So hang with me and I will get these sorted. Okay, looks like we're set. Yeah, I will send everybody a note a couple minutes before we're going to come back so that you know that that's happening, and enjoy each other.
Welcome back, everybody. Just have to hydrate real quick, but hope y'all enjoy the conversations with friends you made. And also, if you want to connect with those friends at a later time, just feel free to connect with us, and we'll make sure to to make those matches as best as we can. I know I chatted with Natalie and also with Daryl, so we're looking forward to connecting later. And also, I think what's great about that is one thing we talked about in our group discussion is how we're trying to move in a direction that's new and different, and that uncertainty can generate a sense of fear. But I think what's helpful is to lean into that uncertainty with a group of people who can support you and listen and understand and empathize and then help guide you from that point. And so hopefully that's what you were able to establish with the small group discussions, and we'll continue to facilitate through this series. And as we folks are starting to arrive with us, bringing us back to the big room, I would like to just have some final reflections and invite some of our presenters to share what they discussed in their groups. And then also if there are folks who would like, so our initial presenters, if they can share some reflections they have, as well as anyone else on the call, if you would like to come off of mute and share some reflections you had, feel free to click the reactions just to raise your hand and I'll know to call on you. How does that sound? All right, I see a lot of smiling faces and nodding heads, so that's perfect for me. Shruti, can I call on you just to share a couple of reflections?
Sure. We had such a wonderful human moment. I really appreciate, thank you to my group. One question that came up at the end, which I think is such a great question, which is how do we continue to pause and act urgently and actually integrate those two things, right? Because philanthropy often gets criticized for this sort of navel gazing. We're like sitting and planning and doing whatever it is we do. So how do we actually pause effectively and keep that pause, and then also hold kind of the urgency of the work? And so I thought that was a great question for us to think on.
Thank you. And Pia or Supriya, I'd like to invite you to share any thoughts that came up during your discussions. Oh, I see a hand pointing. Oh, sorry.
I was just saying, Supriya and I were in the same group.
Oh.
So you want to share?
I feel like I've been doing so much talking. Do you want to go? I could, but I want to give you some space.
Okay, it was also just a lovely group, Carlos, just briefly. Of course, the permission is permission to ourselves that came up, and continuing on this sort of what's the counter immigrant culture notion and where did it come from? You know, the sort of must work to prove oneself or something like that. So it was just really sweet to be in a smaller group and get to hear people's personal stories.
Yes, I agree. And I'm glad you shared that, because that's something that came up in our group as well, is you know, unlearning maybe some habits that we inherited from our families and still honoring those habits. Because if it, like for me, if it wasn't for my father's work ethic, which is not one I would relate to now because we had different perspectives, but I wouldn't have had a college education paid for. I wouldn't have had all these things that he worked hard for me. So I have to honor that, but also still know that that's not my path, because I see value in having a different work ethic. And so that's a little bit of unlearning, but also still knowing that even though I'm going a different path, I can still honor that person. So other thoughts from the crowd? And you're welcome to jump off, please.
I wanted to kind of raise a question that I offered in the chat box, and I see some great responses already. But I'm hoping that, especially given the work that you all do, Supriya, Pia, and Shruti, intentionally creating space for grantee partners to pause. I mean, funders play such an important role in modeling and setting the tone. And kind of, you know, really influencing the way others kind of want to model their own behavior. So I'm curious, like, just some very practical ways that funders should be intentionally thinking about giving space for grantee partners, modeling that. Are there some pieces of advice you would offer as folks on this call think about how they can connect these ideas to their grant making practice? And Supriya, you offered some great reflections already in the chat, but I would welcome thoughts from all three of you.
I just want to add to what I put is, you know, you don't want to see this as an extra, like, you know, I'm just gonna, just this year, let's, like, you know, make some special grants for, you know, go on a retreat have everybody go do a retreat, or, you know, connect with generative somatics or Rockwood. How is that integral to the way that we see it's the work that we support, and have those conversations? Somebody said it here, it was in my small group, I think, both Gurley and Eve mentioned, like, how do you do that with the partners and let them lead? Like, what's the support that they need? Because these, again, are not separate things. It's not like you go, Rockwood is integral. It has been such a vital part of how we have shaped and shifted leadership in our movement. So like, how come we don't see that as like together? And then I will say, a reflection back for us as Hidden Leaf, as being one of the few funders that has been funding that work for so long. How do you not make that like, you must go do the yoga retreat, you must go? Then it becomes yet again another kind of high hurdle for people to cross over. And how do we get to the curiosity? I think this is one of the benefits of being a small family foundation. It's actually incumbent upon us to be in the experimental space and to be in the question, and not see it as a failure if those things couldn't happen in the way that we predicted or thought, but really be in the question of what did it do to invite that in for you in this year? And how does that change your trajectory over the next 5 to 10 years? And how is actually pausing and reflection, you know, groups in the Southwest talk about like sweat lodges, an integral part of your organizing model, because that's what we are there to support the organizing. How is that so vitally important? And the last thing I'll add, Shaady, to your question, it is often it's often difficult to support those intermediary organizations, and they are vitally important I believe absolutely in supporting the frontline groups. What's that right connection and the support also to the intermediary organizations that are holding the space for practice, and who actually wouldn't exist if not for the frontline? So you really have to kind of get that kind of connection right. But there's something about the ecosystem of support that we could be thinking about beyond just like, here's some resources to go do a retreat, but like, what's the ecosystem that we support to really kind of invite this work in? And I see so many of my peers here who are actually coming to the fore. I'm really proud of many of the foundations represented here who have actually been turning that question inside to their own foundation. So how are we supporting that out there and turning it in? So I actually think there are a number of people who could answer this question on this webinar as well.
That's wonderful, Supriya. It sounds like we're all in good company. And as we come to our final closing thoughts and reflections for today's session, I wanted to ask each of our panelists if they can share just a reflection for our attendees to think about doing later, a potential shift in their thoughts, their actions. What would we like a takeaway for our attendees?
Offer one that I've been approaching with curiosity, which is just like, each of us knows how to be excellent. There's some domain in our life where we know we have habits, we have practices, right? We know how to fund a staff person, or we know how to, and so what if we applied those same habits to this, right? So if we know how to fund a staff member, we know how to fund a physical space, how would we fund pausing if it were kind of on par with that? Or if we know how to do something in seriousness for our children or for our partners or for our family, what if that same set of practices and disciplines we applied to this? How could we recruit the skills we have into this?
Thank you. Supriya, Pia?
I've recently been thinking about the idea that perfection is the hunt for pain. So I would just give ourselves permission to not be perfect and be curious instead, or be present instead, with ourselves, in our relationships, in our work. And also just like, we haven't talked about that much, but like singing, dancing, cuddling, I don't know. It's okay to feel good, even when shit is shit outside. You know what I mean? Thank you for being here.
It's important to feel good. I mean, I will just, Jody Tanita, who is one of the wonderful people I get to work with, says, you know, we have to live our joy despite the outcome. And this was what people were saying before we went through this election season. No matter what happens, we live our joy. So I'll offer that as my parting words. And thank you all so much for being here, and what an honor and what a gift.
I echo that. Thank you, Supriya. Thank you all of us. Thank you all to all of you for joining us. And there is a survey we've added in the chat box. We'd appreciate if you can just take a minute or two to complete that survey, because that information will be very valuable to us as we look to improve future programming. And then I also wanted to share with you that the next session for our trust, the ethos of being trust-based, will be on Thursday, January 21st from 10 to 11:30. And I will go ahead and drop a link for that in the chat box so you can check it out. That's linked to where it's at on the Catalyst webpage. But any questions, feel free to reach out to us, and we'll look forward to connecting later. Take care all.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.